The Apostle Paul. I've got a love-hate relationship with Paul. Lots of people seem to. On the one hand, Paul is responsible for some of the most powerful and best-loved passages in the Bible. Love is patient, love is kind. There is no longer male or female, Jew or Greek, for all are one in Christ Jesus. Nothing in all creation can separate us from the love of God. Paul's words are anchors of faith for many people. Even people who've never set foot in a church can quote Paul from memory. On the other hand, Paul can be temperamental and prickly. He's got a huge ego and he can't stand for his authority to be challenged. It helps me extend some compassion and understanding to Paul to remember that he wasn't writing for posterity. Paul would be stunned to know that his letters were still being read 2,000 years after his lifetime. Paul expected Jesus to return imminently, like Tuesday after lunch. Paul thought this world was rapidly passing away. He wasn't giving directions to all Christian communities for all time. He was trying to get a few young, conflict-ridden churches to hold together until Jesus came again. While I think Paul would have driven me up the wall personally, I can respect the difficulty of his work and the skill with which he carried it out. His very humanness gives me and really all of us permission to be human too. Paul is both transcendent and temperamental in the second letter to the Corinthians. Paul had founded the church in Corinth, a port city in Greece, 10 or 20 years after the resurrection of Jesus. Paul stayed in Corinth for a while, then traveled on to start other churches, but he kept in touch with the Corinthians by letter. They'd write Paul about their problems and struggles. Paul would write back with advice, and his letters would be read aloud to the whole church. The pressing issue in the second letter to the Corinthians is that some rivals of Paul have shown up in town. Paul sarcastically calls them super apostles. And their advice conflicts with Paul's. Paul says Christians don't have to follow Jewish dietary laws. The super apostles say they do. Paul didn't accept any money from the Corinthians while the church was getting started. The super apostles are demanding payment for their ministry. The competition from the super apostles really gets Paul's goat. He goes on what I can only describe as an epic rant. It's 3 chapters of Paul at his bombastic, self-righteous best. We heard just the last little bit of it this morning. The super apostles have been bragging about their mystical experiences, visions in which Jesus appeared and spoke directly to them. Paul has had those experiences too. He knows a person, and Paul knows a person in the same way that we ask for a friend, who had a vision of the third heaven, a level of paradise where one sees God face to face. Maybe it was a bodily experience, maybe something Paul saw in his mind's eye. He still can't tell 14 years later. While in the third heaven, Paul heard things that are so wonderful, no mortal person can repeat them. But is Paul going to brag about his private mystical knowledge? No. The super apostles have been dismissing him as a physically weak person with a thin voice. They say, sure, he can write well, but when you actually meet the guy, nobody can possibly take him seriously. Paul doesn't try to argue with that. Instead, he turns the tables on the super apostles. Paul is going to brag about his weakness. Paul has a thorn in his side. We don't know what this metaphor refers to, whether it's a physical ailment or something else. Whatever it is, it torments Paul. It reminds him continuously that despite his gifts and accomplishments, he is all too human. 3 times he asked Jesus to heal him, remove the thorn from his flesh. But Jesus said no. Paul is the latest great leader in the Bible whose prayers were not answered. Moses prayed to enter the promised land. King David prayed that his son with Bathsheba would live. Jesus prayed that he would not have to be crucified. And God said no to all of them. Paul is in good company. What Jesus did say to him is, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness." Paul was writing in Greek. New Testament scholar David Fredrickson points out that the Greek word for weakness comes from a root that means to hold together, to cohere. Weakness literally means coming undone, falling apart. Weakness can be sickness, a physical or mental illness. Fredrickson says it can also be a failure of resolve, a lack of fortitude in the face of despair. Weakness, in this sense, is the human condition. Nobody can hold together all the time. At some point in our lives, we all get sick. We all struggle and suffer. We all come undone. It happened to Paul with the thorn in his side. It even happened to Jesus in his despair as he hung on the cross. Yet weakness is where God's power is made perfect. Made perfect in Greek is really more like reaching full maturity, truly becoming what something can be. God's power reaches full maturity in falling apart. This may seem contradictory, but it might make sense when we think about it for a moment. Jesus, the Son of God in human flesh, accepted the ultimate human weakness when he died. It wasn't only his spirit that came undone on the cross, it was his tortured and broken body. But it was in this ultimate weakness that God's power was fully revealed. The giver of life gave new life to Jesus, raising him from the dead and breaking the ability of death to separate human beings from God. The weakness of Jesus' despairing spirit and broken body was the space God needed to work in. And without that weakness, no human being, and perhaps not even God, would have known what divine power could do. It took Jesus coming undone for God's power to reach its full potential. So Paul can brag about his weakness. It's only when Paul is weak, when he knows he is weak, that the giver of life has room to work in Paul. When Paul is trying to be strong and do everything for himself, it shuts God out. Paul is a weak person who can't hold together. The super apostles are right about that. But look what God has been able to do in and through Paul. Paul founded not only the church at Corinth, but nearly 20 churches across the Eastern Mediterranean. He wrote letter after letter after letter to these churches. 7 books of the New Testament are definitely by Paul, with 5 more attributed to him. Paul was the one to realize that you didn't have to be Jewish to be a disciple of Jesus. He convinced the other apostles to open Christianity up to anyone who wanted to join. Arguably, Christianity probably would not have survived without Paul's founding of churches, his ministry of letter writing, and his advocacy of Gentiles in the church. Paul couldn't accomplish any of that on his own. It was the power of God reaching full maturity in Paul's weakness that did it all. It's odd to be reading this part of the second letter to the Corinthians on the 4th of July. Strong is what every nation wants to be. The United States certainly wants to project an image of cohesion and strength both at home and abroad. Yet we are a deeply divided country. We can hardly agree on basic facts anymore. It may seem as though we are coming undone, falling apart. But how might our weakness create space for God to work? How might God's power come to full maturity in our disunity and weakness? And if God can work in and through the weakness of nations, God can work on a smaller scale, closer to home. The Diocese of Southern Ohio, of which St. John's is a part, is going through a rough time. Our bishop, Thomas Breidenthal, retired suddenly last fall because of alcoholism. A survey of our diocese earlier this year found that we are not ready to elect a new diocesan bishop. We need to address our problems of trust and strained relationships first. It was an acknowledgement of weakness, that in some ways our diocese has come undone. But weakness gives God's power space to work. We know we have problems. Now we can address them with God's help. God willing, in a couple of weeks, we will have a provisional bishop, Bishop Wayne Smith, who will lead our diocese for a couple of years while we work to build trust and strengthen relationships. Bishop Smith had a Zoom call with clergy a couple weeks ago, and he reminded us that we won't stay undone. He said, "There's nothing wrong with you. You've got stuff. Everybody's got stuff." And he expressed confidence that we could and would do the work we need to do and be ready to elect our next bishop. It reminded me of Paul's words to the Corinthians. Falling apart is the human condition. When we fall apart, we don't fix ourselves. The power of God binds us together and makes us cohere again. On balance, I have to say my love for Paul outweighs my annoyance with him. He reminds us that God's power, God's ability to heal and strengthen and renew, is stronger than our very human weakness. Even in these turbulent seasons in our diocese and our country, we have hope. We will find, as Paul did, that whenever we are weak, then we are strong. For it is in our weakness that the power of God works in us and through us.